Inspire Washington acknowledges that we and our partners statewide are on the homelands of Native peoples who have lived in this region since time immemorial. We pay respect to their elders, both past and present. We also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands where all of our cultural partners live and work. Currently, there are 42 tribes, 35 of which are federally recognized, that share traditional homelands and waterways in what is now Washington state. Some of these are nations and confederacies that represent multiple tribes and bands. Inspire Washington recognizes all of them. We express our deepest respect for and gratitude towards these original and current caretakers and culture bearers of the region. As a cultural sector, we acknowledge our responsibility to establish and maintain relationships with these tribes and Native peoples in support of tribal sovereignty and the inclusion of their voices in teaching art, heritage, natural science, and providing cultural programming. We pledge that our relationships will consist of mutual trust, respect, and reciprocity. We are right now currently in Port Townsend, which is on the ancestral homelands of the S'Klallam peoples. Good afternoon, everyone. Before we get started, we feel it's always a little bit important to share a little bit about ourselves. We represent all of you, the cultural sector, in many places where resources are distributed and decisions are made. So it's totally legit for you to wonder what shapes how we advocate for you. What experiences do we bring to these spaces when we talk about cultural work? Well, I'm Annie Kowalin. I'm the executive director of Inspire Washington, but I'm proudly a third generation Washingtonian. I was born and raised in King County. My grandfather hopped a boat in the 1930s and ended up in Washington State after working in the fields of California and the canneries of Alaska. My family today lives in King, Chelan, and Grant County. My mother immigrated to the United States from the Philippines in the 1960s, and we're all really proud to call Washington State our home. I have my own cultural story. I first discovered the joys of creativity in high school. Every day I got up and arrived at school before most of the students did. Why? Because choir started at 7 o'clock. And even though I went to a big sports school, the reality is football got done probably around 6 o'clock, but us theater kids, we were there till late at night because we had tech rehearsal. Theater has been my passion. It's how I got involved in cultural work. It's also where I feel like I developed the most critical skills that I use every day. These skills are life skills. Through my career in theater, I've been a director and a performer and a teaching artist. What's been really special about my teaching artistry for many of you, I see lots of arts educators in here. My programs really partnered with the City of Seattle Human Services Department, where we really lifted up the identities of young people and use arts as a way of developing the most critical and necessary and uplifting of skills. I see a lot of museum people in the room, and I want to tell you I understand your needs. Theater translates really well into the heritage field. It's all storytelling. I was really thrilled to work in the museum field, actually at the Wing Luke, as their exhibit developer and exhibit manager, developing a number of stories that really highlighted communities in Seattle, King County, and beyond. I see many executive directors here. I certainly understand the challenges of your work and the deep joy. I've been executive director for Langston Hughes Performing Art Institute, a home for Black brilliance. Prior to this job, I was the executive director for Youth Theater Northwest because my time in high school inspired me to always think about what our young people need to develop their creative skills. And now I take all these experiences and try my best to represent you and tell your stories in cultural advocacy.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jessie Wasson. I'm the Programs and Operations Manager for Inspire Washington. And much like Manny, I got my start in theater very young. Although I was bit by the theater bug at the age of 7 when I performed as Ursula in my elementary school production of The Little Mermaid. And I have to admit, I think that might have been my peak. But since then, my passion for theater has gravitated toward behind the scenes. I became a stage manager out of college and worked in many of the larger equity houses in Seattle, as well as some of the fringe theaters and Woodnow and all the outdoor places that I love so much. I also spent some time out in New York doing the New York theater thing, but of course came back because there's no better place in the Pacific Northwest. I met Manny at Youth Theater Northwest, where I was the development director. So those of you who raise money and talk to donors and throw galas and write all those grants, gosh, I know how challenging and demanding that work can be. So I respect all that challenging work. I also spent some time in the heritage field as well as the family and programs manager for the Jewish Community Center. And gosh, if you know anything about Jews, we have holidays every week, every month, and they're basically their own little show. So I really enjoyed that time planning fun things for kids to do in the Jewish community. I spent some time as the company manager out at Village Theater, and for the last year and a half or so, I've been at Inspire Washington. My Washington State story, I'm a fourth generation Washingtonian. I grew up on Tiger Mountain outside of Issaquah. So for those of you who know King County, I am a Kid Stage kid through and through since 1994. I'm very proud of that. But now my family lives up in the Methow Valley in beautiful Okanogan County, as well as down in Walla Walla. And I'm thrilled to be representing arts, heritage, and science organizations for Washington State. Here's our agenda for the day. For this afternoon, I know that we have some friends in the house. However, there's a lot of you I know who have never come in contact with the work that we do. So we're going to give you an overview of what Inspire Washington is and does, and what is the role of cultural advocacy in our state. And then we will dive right into the legislative session and talk about all of the updates that you need, bills that were passed, funding that's coming your way, and make sure you're prepared for that. And then we want to spend some time hearing what you all need. How are things going in your community? How can we further support you in the next legislative session and beyond?
Inspire Washington opens doors to science, heritage, and the arts. Here's our mission statement. I'll give you a few moments to review that. Founded in 2019 with the merger of two organizations, Cultural Access Washington and the Washington State Arts Alliance, Inspire Washington is your cultural advocacy organization. We exist to serve every state community, from Spokane to Seattle, from Kennewick to Kitsap, from Wenatchee to Whatcom. And right here where I am today in Port Townsend, we serve all communities by supporting all of you, our cultural partners. You are the ones that inspire Washington communities every day with cultural programs. All of us share common values, passions, and beliefs. Your cultural work adds uplifting value to community life, bringing joy, forging human connections, and inspiring tremendous social impact. We are not nice to have. On the contrary, our community needs us right now more than ever. You are essential to reconnecting communities after 2 years of distancing and polarization. Together, we are mighty. Inspire Washington's Advocacy Coalition combines and focuses the energy of thousands of people and organizations and businesses that provide science, heritage, and arts activities and experiences to every one of Washington's cities and towns. What do we do every day and year round? Coalition building. We are connecting galleries on Orcas Island with the Symphony in Vancouver and music venues in downtown Spokane. We are building a big cultural team and coordinating with allies like tourism, education, and economic development, to name a few. Advocacy, one of the most important things we are doing right now. Advocacy ensures that someone is sticking up for you, the cultural sector, and representing us within every space where decisions are made and resources distributed. Like with members of Congress when we advocated for pandemic relief, and in state government, we are excited to share more about what happened in the last legislative session. But what's next? What other resources need to be developed so that your work may thrive? Is it money? Likely. Is it laws and policy? Yes, but what are those? Or something else? We are here to share more about this work and to listen to you so that we can shape our political agenda of tomorrow. We also know that you crave and rely community within the industry. We are all holding each other up right now. Our education programs provide networking and professional development opportunities, like the Cultural Congress. That was our in-person statewide conference. Although we were able to have to gather everyone virtually last year, we do aspire to gather all of us in person, and we hope to do that next year. And Madeline, our advocacy coordinator, she is always developing advocacy teams and developing toolkits to make that advocacy work easier, as well as communicate all the needs that we want to share with the leaders who make decisions. We are committed to representing science, heritage, and arts organizations across Washington by spending more time listening, showing up in person, and working in towns and communities across the state. Thank you for joining us today.
So when we talk about the cultural sector or culture work in general, this is who we meet. At Inspire Washington, we represent 3 buckets of work. The first being science and technology, which includes nature conservancies, fish hatcheries, zoos, science and innovation centers, and aquariums. The second is heritage, which is historical, cultural, and heritage sites, humanities, and museums. And the third being the arts, visual arts, literature, music, dance, theater, the list goes on and on. All together as a coalition, we are stronger.
To champion greater support for cultural programming, we must start with building greater awareness. Storytelling is one of the most important things we do with you and for you. With storytelling, we aim to turn adversaries into allies, supporters into active champions. Your stories awaken an imagination that our programs offer more than a fun and entertaining Friday night, although there is great value in that too. These are some of the stories that I tell. Did you know that the arts, the cultural sector, and the broad creative economy represents 10.8% of the state's GDP? That's more than the construction industry. Your work is essential to Washington's financial health. I also want to put that number into a little perspective. Last year, when we did our cultural sectors, cultural futures tour, our percentage of the state's GDP was 10.3%. So despite all the challenges, we as an industry, we're still growing. Why? Because of all the hard work that you are doing. I also want to put that number into perspective by comparing it to other states. The best way to get the apples to apple comparison is not by the dollars. It's really by the percentage of states' GDP. Right now, Washington State with 10.8% ranks number 1 in the nation, higher than California that doesn't even break 8%. We are in many spaces where we are told that we are nice and it's really wonderful, but we're not essential, and that's not true. The cultural industry is jobs. The cultural industry is a pillar of Washington's financial health, and the cultural industry is an opportunity to invest more to get more. Other stories I tell, rigorous studies have shown that students who engage in artistic classes are more likely to graduate, like me, that showed up every day, not because I was excited about my trigonometry class, but because I was excited about choir. Join us as storytellers and share these topics with your elected officials, businesses, social media, donors, and the broader community.
Inspire Washington cannot do our work alone. Our partners are woven into the fabric of everything we do. We collaborate with organizations, government, and advocates every day. We are the thread that brings all 3 together, that inspires change, creates meaningful experiences that enhance our quality of life. Here is a list of our partner organizations. They are businesses who pay dues to support the work of Inspire Washington. We are a small but mighty team and rely on the invested partnerships of businesses. Currently, we have just over 114 statewide partners, and we hope you'll consider joining us in the future. Our dues are very modest. They start at only $100 a year. But more than the money, this showing a statewide list of invested partners shows the broad strength of our coalition, so that when we go to lawmakers or government agencies or things like that, we can show this list and show, hey, look, we are a force. We are a large group of cultural workers that need support and strength. Here's a list of our government partners. We have many great relationships with lawmakers at the city, county, state, and federal level. We work with many different divisions of state government on behalf of the cultural sector, most notably the Washington State Department of Commerce and ArtsWA. Funny enough, we are here in Port Townsend right now, participating in the ArtsWA Creative Districts convening. So we work with a lot of different divisions of government, and we're really grateful for their collaboration. And finally, our advocates. None of what we do and accomplish could be done without our advocates. They are the backbone of our work, and we are so grateful for your collaboration. They participate in iAlerts, they sign in and testify for bills, they meet with lawmakers, and they help spread the word. So that's kind of an example of what Inspire Washington, what we do, but I'm going to give you some really concrete examples of what we've been doing the last year. So the majority of our work is centered around the Washington State legislative session. The goal is always to secure funding and pass bills that are favorable to the cultural sector. This sounds simple, but there's so much prep work that goes into that. Relationship building, strategy, organizing and educating people, and creating content to communicate the need. All of these things take months of work prior to the start of the session in January. There's also a long list of activities that happen during the legislative session, such as the Get Loud for Culture virtual rally we held in February of 2022, when we brought advocates from across the state together to share our objectives with the broad cultural sector. Transparency is very important to us, so we always make time and provide opportunities to share our objectives for provide time for advocates to give feedback. The 2022 legislative session was historic. Thanks to federal pandemic relief funding, our sector was provided $50 million in total, 45 for smaller businesses through the Working Washington 5 grant program, and $5 million for our larger cultural institutions for COVID relief funding. We worked closely with the Department of Commerce and ArtsWA as they developed the Working Washington 5 grant program criteria, and we provided input and gave feedback to the portal that was eventually created by Submittable. We knew that that funding opportunity wasn't going to be on people's radar, because how often do cultural businesses receive funding from the Department of Commerce? Not all that often, right? So we launched last year's Cultural Futures Tour primarily out of the need to spread the word about the Working Washington 5, but also to provide insight about what happened during the legislative session and to get your feedback about what you need for next year. Your local insight is essential to the work, and all the stories that you share with us help us to build a case and an agenda and strategy for the following session. Last year, we visited 16 cities and held 10 virtual sessions on our Cultural Futures Tour and collected so much information that was vital and key to this year's success in the legislative session. You all filled out surveys, which I hope you'll do again after this. And we compiled all that information to a report and gave it to the legislators, and they read that and realized how great the need was. And I guarantee you that without those surveys that you filled out in the report, the funding resources that we're going to be talking with you about today would not have happened. So kudos to you for showing up and being involved in the process. Following the success of our Cultural Futures Tour, the Department of Commerce sponsored a second tour. So after a quick 1-month break, we headed out on the road and visited another 14 cities and towns on our residency program. And this tour was focused around the continued outreach for Working Washington 5 with help sessions. We met with state lawmakers in preparation for the next session, and we met with allied industries like economic development, tourism, and hospitality. This work is all about relationship building and connecting people to ideas. Also within the legislative session, we host Arts, Heritage, and Science Week. This is a super fun 1-week event when advocates from around the state get together to meet with their lawmakers and talk about the cultural agenda. We schedule meetings for district teams, either in person or virtual, and provide all the talking points and support you need to be successful. This is a great first-time advocate event since you're there with hundreds of other people from varying degrees of experience, and everyone works together and supports each other. We also have fun events, which is always a good time, networking, mixers, and performances. This year, we had 210 advocates from all 49 districts who held 58 in-person meetings and 46 virtual meetings, which was a record for Inspire Washington, and we hope to continue to build on that next year. So mark your calendar, February 5th, 2024, either in person in Olympia or virtual. Outside of the legislative session, we're also engaged in the federal space. Last year, we held 2 town halls with members of Congress, Adam Smith and Pramila Jayapal. These events are a great opportunity to engage with your federal representatives and advocate for additional federal support. We're hoping to schedule town halls with the other 10 members of our Washington delegation in the next couple months, but scheduling is always a challenge, so we'll keep you posted on that. Also in February, we as a team flew to DC as part of the Western Arts Federation Arts Leadership and Advocacy Seminar. We met with all 12 offices and impressed upon them the importance of increased funding for the NEA and NEH and urged them to either reintroduce or sponsor a number of bills that would support the creative industries. Creating and maintaining relationships with lawmakers is one of the most valuable things that Inspire Washington does for the cultural sector, and we're always looking for folks to join in this work. So if you have any interest in meeting with lawmakers with us, we'd love to have you.
Now that's a lot of information, and of course, we do all this work to represent all of you. So if you have any questions about our activities or further details you want to know about our past year, this is a great time to ask.
Or just drop it in the chat, and we can take care of that as we keep going.
All right. Well, as you can see, at the heart of everything we do is advocacy. So let's talk more about the power of advocacy and how you may engage to secure the resources you need and to build greater awareness about what you do and why it matters. In the simplest of terms, advocacy is the act of pleading for, supporting, or recommending, but it's more than that. And it's not scary or intimidating, although I know that it can feel that way. And I know that all of us, every day, every month, every year, we have new things to learn. But I want to assure you that I believe advocacy is something that you are already doing and doing very well. Advocacy exists to educate, to enlighten, to illuminate, and to inspire. Advocacy is leadership. Every day you show up for your cultural work. You tell your story, you lead your organization or your program. It can also be the grant you're writing or the donor letter that's due next week. Oh, Madeline, if you could advance the slide. Advocacy is also relationship building. It can be all the outreach that draws a larger circle of supporters to your work. Advocacy is most certainly storytelling. Like when I worked at the Youth Theater Company, because of the recession, we were on the brink of closure. So we brought the people who cared the most, the children in the youth theater, to speak to city council. They wanted to tell their story. When you show up at your city council meeting, it's like when a pebble drops into a pond, and that impact ripples far beyond what you may see. Conversations like circles spiraling throughout the community. Now, it also may feel a little bit manipulative because the children were a wee tall and the microphone was so high. And, you know, many of us executive directors, we got to do all the things. And that may sometimes mean lifting the kids up to the microphone to tell their story. But honestly, since I was in that room with them, I felt it was the most authentic performance I'd ever been part of. Here were young people, members of the community, not afraid to talk to the people that represent them, the leaders, and to share stories about their concerns about what's going on. They were working so hard. They were afraid they couldn't do their show. Youth Theater Northwest was their home, their creative home where all their friends were, and they didn't want to see it go away. That day, we showed up asking for $17,000. We walked away with twice as much. City Council was determined to close out our emergency fundraising campaign. The moral of this story is show up at your city council with your community. Figure out the best people to tell your story and share that story. Okay, I know there's an elephant in the room. Some of you probably have concerns. Every time I talk about advocacy, I hear from nonprofit leaders and they say, no, we're not allowed to advocate. We can't do that. We're nonprofit. I want to clarify this because it stands in our way a lot. And it's essentially not true. Certainly, if your organization is a 501c3 tax exempt organization, there are limitations for how much you may lobby, but certainly advocacy is allowed. Lobbying is advocacy, but not all advocacy is lobbying. So to clear this up, I want to be very specific about what lobbying is. Lobbying has three key ingredients. One, You are communicating with a decision maker, and that decision maker is an elected official or the staff member that's there to represent them. And sometimes it may mean voters for a ballot measure. That's the first ingredient. Two, you must be discussing existing or potential legislation. Now, legislation isn't an idea for funding. Legislation is not sitting down and talking about the importance of, say, arts education funding, right? Legislation is very specific legal language and content that has been registered with the clerk of the elected chamber or council, city council, county council, state legislature, Congress. And it usually is easy to spot because it has a really identifiable name, like House Bill 1234, Senate Bill 2222, Ordinance or Resolution 5678. That's the second ingredient for lobbying. The last ingredient, you are urging the decision maker or the staff member that represents them to vote for or against, yes or no. So if you are talking to an elected official, discussing legislation, and telling them to vote yes, then certainly you are lobbying. But when you're just sitting down and talking about the importance of your work, when you're setting the stage for support, that is advocacy. That is allowed. Let's go a little deeper. The IRS actually does permit tax-exempt organizations to lobby in limited amounts. It just cannot be a significant portion of your organizational work and therefore a significant percentage of your annual budget. For example, that day that I showed up at City Council with those kids, I spent like an hour and a half there. The rest of my 40, 60, 80 hours that week was at the theater, getting ready for a show, printing programs, whatever I needed to do, not lobbying. So if you're spending more time in Washington, D.C. or in Olympia or in your city council, city hall, instead of your cultural business, then maybe you have some problems, but generally you're probably fine. Here's a good rule of thumb. Nonprofits may lobby for issues like ballot initiatives, but just not in candidate elections. That's like stacking the deck. So basically, issues, not people. I hope all of this has helped convince you about the importance of advocacy. In our representative government, advocacy is a critical part of the process. Your lawmakers are elected by the community. They are accountable to you. They want to hear from their voters to know what's important. And trust me, we spent a lot of time walking the halls of Congress and Olympia. If you don't take that meeting with your lawmaker, oh, trust me, someone else is taking that meeting. And I know that you have something beautiful, inspirational to talk about. There are many places and spaces where decisions are made and resources distributed, opportunities for you to advocate, such as City Council, Chamber of Commerce, County Council, School Board, State Government, Federal Government, and much more.
There are many ways to make your voice heard and support the programs you care about. So now that Manny has told you what advocacy is, I'm going to give you some examples of how to do it. So first, share your passions and your values with your lawmakers. This is a great time to do this. We are in what's called off-session time. So your state lawmakers are back home in their district. They're not down in Olympia. They have a lot more time. They would love to hear from you. So email them, set up a meeting, invite them to come see your summer show or your new exhibit or whatever else that is that you're doing. Maybe you have a new gallery opening coming up. Show them the effect that you have in your community, the importance role that you play in your community or on Main Street. So highly encourage this. They love spending time with you. This last summer, Manny and I, we did many lawmaker visits throughout the state. And there was one lawmaker meeting that we had with Representative Orcutt. We had 2 hours with him at the Amboy Historical Museum. So much more time and opportunity to create relationships as opposed to in the session where you're lucky if you get 15 minutes with your lawmaker. So you send them an email, always include their legislative aid, ask them to come and check out your business. 2, if that feels a little bit too much for you to do, you can always attend Arts, Heritage, and Science Week in Olympia, and we will schedule everything for you. We'll even give you talking points and everything. So again, mark your calendar, February 5th, 2024. On a smaller scale, you can always support a bill by signing in or testifying during the next legislative session. We sent out many emails this last session asking folks to sign in pro for one of our bills. Thank you all for those of you who did that. It really means a lot. Also, you can participate on our Inspiration League website. We also send out iAlerts, which is kind of the next step past signing in pro. And what is our Inspiration League? Well, let me tell you. The Inspiration League is our online advocate platform. By joining, you can become a local hero for cultural programming in your community. This platform enables us to connect advocates to lawmakers and to champion culture whenever a threat or opportunity arises. Because when you join, you register with your address, so you're directly connected to the people that represent you at the city, county, state, and federal level. So when there is an opportunity or a threat that comes up, we send an email to our Inspiration League. So when you get that, there will be a link to click that opens the Inspiration League platform. And this is what it looks like. So on one side, there will be the issue. What is happening? Why are we telling you about this? Just the nitty gritty of what's going on, whether there's a bill or a budget item that needs attention. And then on the other side will be a pre-written lawmaker template email that Manny and I have written that will go to your lawmaker. It is very important, though, that you read through this. This is representative government, and it's important that you know what you're sending to your lawmaker. It will be super short, no more than 3 paragraphs, because our lawmakers are super busy. We want to respect their time. So please read through this, delete the things you don't agree with, add the things that you would like to, or you can just leave it as is, enter your information, and then you'll click a green button down below and click send. So with 2 clicks from your inbox, you have sent a letter to your lawmaker expressing your concern or your support for a particular issue. This is super important. We drive hundreds and sometimes thousands of emails to our lawmakers every year, and this is how we do it. So please join inspirationleague.org.
All right, now that we've talked a lot about what advocacy is, let's talk about when it matters the most, the state's legislative session. I'm sure most of you joined this call because you want to hear about the resources that are coming your way, and we're going to lay it all out for you. But before we get started, I think it's important for me to provide a little bit of civics class. There's a lot of people that don't understand how things work in Washington, so I'm going to be super brief, but I hope this creates some better context. Based off of the state's constitution, there's one time in the year where our elected body, the legislature, gathers to do 3 core things. They have a responsibility to create new laws, to change existing laws, and to enact budgets. What does that mean with enacting budget? It means they are going to appropriate our hard-won tax money. It's our funds, it's public funds. We need to be part of all 3 of these processes to ensure that cultural sector needs are represented. Who is making all these decisions? Well, let me tell you, the legislature. What is the legislature? It's actually 2 chambers, 2 bodies, the Senate and the House of Representatives. The state of Washington is divided up into 49 distinct geographical legislative districts. Each district elects 1 senator and 2 representatives. We all are members of a district. I live in the 37th district, but if you don't know, you can always find out which district you live in and who represents you by visiting the legislative website at leg.wad.gov and click on District Finder. All right, who else is a big player in the state legislative session? I know everyone always thinks that the governor makes all the decisions, and it's actually not true. The governor plays a very important role, though. Imagine the governor is the executive director, the CEO of the cultural organization that is the state of Washington. The legislature will enact the laws and will create the budgets, and then the governor has a responsibility to administrate all of those funds and all of the programs. But the governor does kick off the legislative session by creating a governor's budget, and that is an opportunity for our highest profile elected leader in Washington state to spotlight issues and opportunities like this year when he put a real focus on issues around affordable housing. So anyway, that gives you a little bit of context for the legislative session. When does it start? It is once a year. It always starts in the 2nd week of January. This year was a biennium. What does that mean? Well, it means that every 2 years, this has a biennium session, or every other year, the state has a biennium session. And one of the big tasks of that session is to create a 2-year budget. That's a big task, creating a budget for the state. And they don't want to do that kind of serious heavy lifting every single year. So they do it for 2 years. The biennium sessions are longer. It starts in January, and this year it went all the way through the end of April. Next year, January of 2024 starts a supplemental budget session. What does that mean? Well, it means they still have a budget. They created it for 2 years, but things happen. We all get this. Things happen in our businesses. Maybe they have more money to distribute. Maybe they have less money and they got to cut their budget. They want to make changes to their budgets. They will amend the budget, but they're still working off of the budget that they created this year in January. So now let's talk about what happened in the legislative session. The legislative session starts with a whole bunch of ideas that become bills, and bills that, if they go through the long legislative process, will become law. Now, this year, to give you a little context, there were 2,308-ish, I believe, bills introduced by senators or representatives. They're the only people who can introduce bills. 2,308 ideas, objectives that could become law, but it was only about 500 that became law. That is really to illustrate the challenging process that a bill has to go through to become a law. The amount of support it has to earn from both chambers, the Senate and the House, and also the arduous process to get through policy committees that continue to vote in favor. There is not just one vote on a bill that makes it law. There's many votes along the way, and there's milestones and deadlines that they have to make. Now, with 500 bills passed, certainly there are a lot of bills that have impact on your lives, on your cultural work, all of that. But today I want to really focus on the bills that have the clearest cultural impact. Because if I was to sit here and just figure out and to do a review of every single bill that had some level of intersection with your work, well, first of all, we'd be here all day. And after all that policy talk, I kind of believe you would never join an Inspire Washington meeting again, because it's just super nerdy. But there are 4 bills that I think that have the most cultural impact, and I'm really excited to talk about them today. The first bill, oh my gosh, I'm so relieved and so thrilled. Inspire Washington was the architect for House Bill 1575. This was our 3rd legislative session trying to get this approved. The first 2 sessions, we kept getting blocked in the first committee. And this year, it was our year, and we got the bill all the way through all the committees in both chambers, and House Bill 1575 became law. Now that this bill is law, we now have councilmanic authority for the already existing Washington State Cultural Access Program. I'm going to explain more. We're going to explain more. We're going to do a deeper dive on this bill later and explain what Cultural Access Program is and what it means to have councilmanic authority. So let's put that in the parking lot, and we're going to come back to it. Next bill, House Bill 1247. Creates a pathway for musicians to become licensed as professional music therapists. This is a big deal because I think we all on this Zoom call recognize the power of music to speak to our hearts, to heal, much like other creative therapies do that. But until this year, there was no pathway for a musician to actually become a professional and licensed therapist. What does that mean? Well, it bars them from resources that other therapy get access to, like insurance claims and things like that. So we're really thrilled that this door has been opened. The Department of Health is creating the program now that will, the pathway for somebody to become licensed as a music therapist. We're really excited now that many people who are brilliant musicians and also, have the right training to also provide therapy, that they're going to be able to tap into a new area of work. While at the same time, what's also important about this, let me tell you about my cousin. He's a wonderful musician, but trust me, he should not provide therapy for anyone. So it really just makes it clear that the world of music therapy is a real thing, and there should be guidance and guidelines. And I think it opens more doors than it closes it. So we're going to learn more about this later in the months to come as they start to develop this program. And we'll probably circle back and do maybe a webinar to explain what the next steps are, if any of you are interested in becoming a licensed music therapist. I do want to point out that these 2 bills, were sponsored by Representative Julia Reed of the 36th District. She was a freshman representative this year, but she has, come out in full support of cultural sector. I think she's going to be a huge championess of ours. If you are in the 36th District, please reach out and say thank you to her. And I also want to point out another theater kid from high school. We are changing the world. All right, the next bill. Senate Bill 5436, the legal transfer of firearms to museums. You may recall that years ago, I can't remember the year, I think it was 2012, the citizens of Washington State, we all voted on an initiative to ensure firearm responsibility. And in that initiative, it requires that anytime someone purchases a firearm or a firearm is transferred to another person, the recipient or the purchaser, there's a background check conducted on them. That makes total sense. It's completely responsible. Well, here's a problem. If you have a firearm, perhaps it's historic, perhaps there's a really great story around this firearm, and you wanted to donate it to your local museum, you can't background check the museum, and therefore the museum could not accept that firearm. This has created a real problem and an unintended consequence of that initiative that we all voted on for museums, especially in rural areas, and it needed to be fixed. If you've worked at museums like I have, you understand the strict focused process to take something into your collections and the responsibility you have to safeguard your collections. If somebody wants to donate their grandfather's rifle to a local museum, for example, and they want to put it in a case and tell a story about it, they should be able to do that, and they should not be blocked. Weirdly, that initiative that we voted on allowed people to loan firearms to performing arts organizations, and then they could put that firearm on stage. This was clearly just an unintended consequence of the policy that was developed. Often policy is not perfect in the beginning, and it takes some sculpting to make it better. So now, because our partners at the Washington Museum Association's advocacy work on Senate Bill 5436 that was sponsored by Representative Jeff Wilson, museums and historical societies can now take firearms into their collections. There will still be a Washington State Patrol background check, but not at the extent that would prohibit any museum or institution from accepting one. All right. And the last bill I want to talk about is House Bill 1639. Which creates the authority for the Billy Frank Jr. statue. If you don't know, I'm excited to share with you that every state in our nation is represented in our state capitol, in the Capitol building, with a statue in Statuary Hall, which is adjacent to the House of Representatives. Washington State for many years has been represented by a statue of Marcus Whitman. And Marcus Whitman has had his time, and we are thrilled, as many communities are across Washington State, that now Washington will be represented with the civil rights leader, Billy Frank Jr., a member of the Nisqually tribe. Now, why do we need a bill to do this work? Well, because the state of Washington is guided by bills and law. They just can't simply do activities without some kind of legal framework. So the passage of this bill creates the framework for them to collect money, because they're going to need to take some donations, even though the state puts some of their own money into this process. They're going to need to take, they need the framework to collect money, to have the authority to make the decisions to remove the statue in DC, and to select an artist, and to approve a statue, and all those things. And this bill will now provide that framework. So we're really thrilled. This was championed by Representative Lekanoff, and we're really excited. Join us probably in 2025 when we will see this statue. 2 statues will be made, one that will go to Washington, DC, and one that will be in our state capitol in Olympia. And those are all the cultural bills, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have about them.
Okay, well, I'm going to keep us moving and chat about budgets, but if you have any questions, just put them in the chat, and Manny will get to them while I'm talking about budget. So much like bills, there's an awful lot of things that happen in the budget. The budget is a 1,200-page document. So there's a lot of things in there, but again, I'm just going to talk about the really high level things that affect the broad cultural sector. So number one, $2 million for the cultural sector. Some background on this. As you heard earlier, last year, thanks to federal pandemic relief funding, ARPA funding, our sector was provided $50 million last year, 45 which went to smaller orgs, 5 million which went to the larger orgs. So this year, and that 50 million was championed by Representative Liz Berry. So this year, when we were going when we were starting the session, Liz Berry also wanted to put forth another request for significant funding for our cultural sector as a whole. So she put a budget proviso in for $25 million. And then about a month after that, the budget forecast came out, wah, wah, wah. And the budget forecast wasn't what we were all hoping for. So she tempered our expectations, not sure if any funding will come through this year, but lo and behold, after all the budget conversations were done, the legislature really acknowledged that the cultural sector needed additional support this year. So we were able to get $2 million for the broad cultural sector. This is really amazing, to be honest. I know it doesn't sound like much, but just to give you some context, prior to the pandemic, we as a cultural sector were never provided any funding in the operating budget like this. So the fact that we are still here, we are still showing need and showing importance within the legislature is pretty great. And I'm going to talk more about this. I have a couple slides later so you can get prepared to receive this funding probably late summer, early fall. Next, Building for the Arts and Heritage Capital, they both received their full funding. Building for the Arts is a Department of Commerce capital program that gives funding to buildings where art is shared. And Heritage Capital, which is run by the Washington State Historical Society, this funding pool gives grants to buildings where Washington history is told. Also, over $2 million was provided to a variety of cultural organizations for local and community capital projects. And if this is something you're interested in, I also have a slide later to talk more about how you may receive funding through this pot as well. Also, there were two, Natalie, you can show both of them, two new ArtsWA programs that received funding this year. The first being the Tribal Cultural Affairs Program. Initially, this was a request of $10 million, but once again, due to the budget drawbacks, they were provided with $1.7 million to get this program going. And what this is going to do is it's going to partner with all the different tribes, those that are federally recognized and those that are not, to strengthen the tribal cultural arts in our state. So we'll work with different tribes as well as different organizations that partner with tribes to provide grants and uplift that work. Also, there was $500,000 that was provided to, hold on a sec, Malin, I'm going to talk about the Therapeutic Arts Program. So this was initially born out of a request that we worked on with ArtsWA for creative therapies for weather trauma. We had heard on our last tour that places up in central and eastern Washington were really suffering due to all the wildfires. And there were a lot of kids that were really struggling with that and were afraid of summer. So one of our partners up there, the Confluence Gallery in Twist, Washington, put together an art therapy camp for their kids a couple summers ago. And this was huge. It made such a big difference for the communities there. We thought, gosh, that's an amazing thing. It needs to keep happening. And then we also heard about similar struggles with folks over in Whatcom County, kids that were still struggling with the effects of mudslides and flooding and things like that. So we put together a request for $3 million to help provide creative therapies for folks suffering from weather trauma. Just to kind of give a little context backing up, at the beginning of the session, Governor Inslee talked about two major things that he wanted to champion this year. Housing, which you heard an awful lot about, and the other one was mental health. So he, as well as the legislature, recognizes that creative therapies are a big part of mental health. So this was born out of that. It'll be $500,000 that will go pretty much strictly towards grants. So different organizations all across the state can apply for these grants to provide therapeutic opportunities through creative avenues to their communities. So more to come on this. I'm imagining they'll start putting this website together maybe in July or August. Also, Artois, they received some additional funding for their Creative Districts program. This is a booming opportunity right now in Washington State. We were told that there are 22 new cities and towns that are on the list of hopefully becoming a certified creative district. So if you're interested in that, there is a lot of traction, a lot of reporting that shows the benefits of becoming a certified creative district through Artois, and they received some additional funding this year to support those programs. So if you're interested, head on over to Artois' Creative District website. Washington Museum Connects program received additional funding to continue this. So a little bit of background. Museums don't have the same resources that arts organizations do to apply for state funding because Artois gives out grants, but there isn't really a specific program similar to that for museums. So Washington Museum Association put together the Museum Connects program, which is working to survey all the museums across Washington State, provide a report, give some feedback to the legislature and say, hey, look at all of these amazing museums all across the state that are providing valuable programs and opportunities for their communities. They deserve funding too. So they're working on that survey, and now this $200,000 will give them 2 more years to continue that work. Last I heard, there was over 800 museums that were surveyed in Washington State. So it's pretty impressive, and I look forward to seeing that report come out later. Also, our partners at Humanities Washington received additional funding to continue their statewide Speakers Bureau program and the Primetime Family Reading program that partners with local libraries. And Artois' total biennium this year was just under $16 million. So if you add that up and so much more, it comes to $67 million for arts, heritage, and science, the broad cultural sector. Congratulations. Any questions on any of these budget requests? Go ahead and drop them in the chat and I will get to them while Manny starts talking about the next topic.
Sure. You know, the one thing I do want to add about the budget is I really just recognize all the challenges your cultural businesses are facing, and we work really hard to advocate for as much. So sometimes we don't always get all the support that we want, but I also want to just really convey that we do hear all the needs and we'll continue to be talking. We celebrate the 67 million, and we also know we have so much more that there's so much more that you need, and we will continue to be putting up a good fight for that. All right, well, put your questions in the chat, and I will continue with House Bill 1575, which provides councilmanic authority for cultural access. Again, like I shared, this is a bill that we've introduced 3 times, and we're really grateful for the win, championed by Representative Julia Reed from the 36th district. This now, we believe, will open more doors for communities across the state to enact a cultural access program. And before we start really diving into what councilmanic means and what was in the House bill, it's really important for us to make sure that we all understand what a cultural access program is and why this is an opportunity for your city or county to develop your own local funding for your amazing cultural programs. Cultural access is many things. It is a state law. It's also a state law that where the legislature is granting their taxing authority to cities or counties. It is an opportunity for local funding, your local community to fund your science, heritage, and arts programs. It is big, it is game-changing, considering where we've been over the last several years. It is the transformative opportunity that your community needs to recover and to reconnect over the joy of cultural programs. Cultural access can significantly expand the public support you receive so that your programs may fully recover and thrive. Here's a little background. In 2015, our state legislature created a law, the Cultural Access Law. That's a program that allows cities and counties to adapt their own local cultural access funding program by increasing sales tax by 0.1% or the equivalent amount through property tax. What does that mean? Well, generally, our research has shown that the average household across Washington would spend somewhere between $15 and $30 per year That's everyone in the household, one time a year, depending on their spending habits and their income. The law, if passed by voters, that has historically been the only pathway to implement a cultural access program. The law provides this authority to collect these taxes for 7 years. What can you do with these funds? Well, you create a funding program for cultural programs. Um, at the heart, the intent of this law was to address and overcome barriers of access to cultural programs. We all know that cultural programs have uplifting value, deep social impact, and also drives local economy. But we also know that there are barriers that stand in the way for families and individuals to access cultural programs. These barriers often are focused on affordability. Sometimes they have to do with the identity of an individual or a family. We know in Washington State that access to cultural programs really has to do with geography. Do you have programs close to your home? All of these things. So therefore, when you create a fund that addresses these barriers, imagine, as an example, funds that can go towards free and reduced tickets for community members, field trips for kids, for example, in-school residencies at your local elementary, middle, or high school, outreach to communities that have been historically not served or under-resourced, and expanded resources for cultural programming, more event nights, programs that you've always wanted to host but have never had the funds to start. Imagine that. But also imagine that organizations could get a sustainable, predictable amount of money every year. Now, I'm involved in every cultural access conversation, and considering the times that we're in and the challenges that all of you have faced and are still facing, it's easy to get caught up in the money related to cultural access. But it's so much more than that. Imagine how an implemented cultural access program will transform community life. Imagine the truly deep impact of this program. Cultural equity throughout a community. I'm certain, because I talk to many of you, I've heard many stories about the communities that you're still trying to reach out to that are not in your audiences or on your exhibit floors or in your classrooms. Imagine being given the resources to ensure that everyone in your community experiences the value, the uplifting inspiration of your cultural program. Also, academic success. Rigorous study shows that students that engage in cultural programs achieve higher levels of academic success. Sometimes, quite simply, they just show up at school and then therefore they will graduate. So if we put more money into encouraging young people to attend school, to be engaged in cultural access program, we also know we are paving a more successful pathway for them at that school. Also, greater economic prosperity and competitiveness. I'm certain you know this as well as I do. I've worked at a cultural organization. Half of every time I crafted a budget was on people. So when we start talking about investing public funds in cultural programs, half of that money is clearly on staffing. So it's more jobs. It's kind of a job bill. And also, when a community has more cultural programs taking place in their community, well, you get more people out on Main Street, and then more people having dinner or drinks before the show or after, parking downtown, hiring babysitters. Honestly, just investing in event-based programs drives more money in your local community and on your Main Street. And of course, also, what many communities care about is more offerings, more opportunities, more things to do on a Friday night and during the weekend for you, your date, or your family. And all of these more cultural programs mean more opportunities for people to get out of their homes, off of their phones, and into their community squares and in community venues to be with each other, to build relationships and all that. One thing I love to say in my advocacy story is Netflix has taken enough of our money ever since the pandemic started. We want to see more of those funds being invested in your programs. And of course, sustainable funding for cultural nonprofits. You've heard us, gosh, last year we were able to secure 50 million, but this year it's only $2 extra million. The up and down of state investment is not something that you can chart a predictable business plan around. You need to know how much you're getting from public funds every year so that you can plan around that. That's how you can actually really grow your cultural program. So we believe that a cultural access program provides you something that you can count on, funding you know will be there next year. And of course, although a tremendous amount of money has been invested in the cultural sector for our recovery, the pandemic has a long tail. We read stories every day about organizations that are struggling or closing, just a recent one again in the Seattle Times and across the nation. So we know that you need more funding to ensure and stabilize your program as we continue to navigate the long tail of the pandemic.
So who's eligible to receive funding from a cultural access program? First, you must be a 501c3 nonprofit organization. You also must be in arts, heritage, or science business. So you must be providing, advancing, and preserving one of those three areas that we at Inspire Washington support. And thirdly, you must provide programming experiences that are available to the general public. Anyone must be able to attend your events. So who is not eligible to receive this funding? Well, you cannot be a state agency, a city government, private foundation, radio or television broadcasting network or station, cable communication system, an internet-based communication venture or service, a newspaper or magazine. Here's a brief history of cultural access. I'm not going to go through each of these things in depth, but just to show that cultural access is not a new idea. It's been around a long time. It all started back in 2006 when the Puget Sound Regional Economic Strategy Council, they took inspiration from Denver, Colorado's cultural access program. They did some outreach to various cities and then put together the very first legislation, which was introduced in the legislative session in 2009. As Manny mentioned earlier, sometimes government and passing bills take some time. So they introduced it a few more times. And then finally in 2015, Senate House Bill 2263 was passed to create the Cultural Access Program. Shortly after that, King County launched the very first county campaign in Washington State and narrowly lost by 4,500 votes. There was an awful lot against that campaign that year, and we can talk about that if you're interested. It was a very short time frame. It was very new, all those things. So, but don't worry, I'm sure King County will be back at some point to champion cultural access. And then in 2018, though, shortly after that, Tacoma Creates. They passed with rousing success of 67% votage. We're thrilled for Tacoma. And then just last year, Inspire Olympia, they passed their own citywide program with a 58% approval. So now we're going to jump forward into the future from our timeline and talk about Council Manic. So House Bill 1575, which was passed just this April, this allows for greater access to cultural access, basically. So what it means, Council Manic, I know it sounds like a really kind of like crazy word, but all it means is that the legislative authority, meaning a city council or a county council, may implement cultural access on their own. It provides more local control for a community. We view this as just another tool in the toolbox for communities. It's an opportunity for communities who may not have the resources, the expertise, or the time to do a public campaign. So therefore, this Council Manic provides council or cultural access to be implemented by simply a majority of council. So you do not have to do a public vote using Council Manic, but a public vote is still totally an option. So again, it just provides another option. Public campaigns can be very, very expensive. So for communities who are ready to go and don't have the resources to do a public campaign, they can implement their own cultural access program, Council Manically.
All right. Well, across Washington State, since House Bill 1575 was passed, there's a tremendous amount of new interest in passing cultural access program. And Inspire Washington, through our Cultural Futures tour, has been talking to all these communities. There's interest in Walla Walla and in Spokane, King County, Gig Harbor, Mason County, Snohomish County, and a few others I can't remember at this time. And each of them have their own unique story. But right now we're talking to a statewide group. So I'm really going to talk broadly about what a roadmap or next steps are for cultural access in your community. And during our question and answer, we could talk a little bit with some more specifics. How do you get started? We've shared a lot of information, and I'm sure you're asking yourself, what's our next step to secure this local community cultural fund? Well, we always suggest that the first thing you do is you build a team. You can't do this work alone. So start by assembling a larger group of partners. Reach out to cultural leaders that are providing science, heritage, and arts programming in your community. You may also want to invite community groups that benefit from cultural programming, like PTSA groups, your Chamber of Commerce, a member of the school board, a community foundation, or other nonprofits that care about your community's cultural health. Next thing you do, it's important to educate your team on this cultural opportunity. You need to explain what cultural access is, why the state granted this program, and what the benefits are for it, and what are the mechanics? How does it work? This is your opportunity to inspire them about new funding and expanded programming. We know that generally, out of these types of meetings, a core leadership group will begin to emerge, and that's the team that will really drive this forward. It is also an opportunity to have the hard conversations. You'll be talking about taxes, and I talk about cultural access all the time, and I can imagine, because I've experienced them, the critical points of views that will begin to surface that you'll need to address and work through. Concerns at the local level about other issues that you're facing and how does this compare and all of those things. But at the end of the day, I also know that what also can inspire your new team to get excited about cultural access is not just the hard conversations, but the fun conversations, the inspiring ones, envisioning the opportunities for your community's cultural future, the challenges your community is facing, but where cultural programs provide an answer. Because at the end of the day, cultural access isn't about the money, it's about the things your community will care about most, those cultural objectives, like struggling businesses, the programs will strengthen, or programs you'll expand, new communities you'll serve, the new programs you'll create, the enhanced education for students at your local schools, the expansion of cultural jobs, just to name a few examples. These are the fun conversations to have. Your community gets to decide how to invest cultural access funds. And we have learned that a successful program requires a clear vision for how you'll invest the public funding and an uplifting and equitable vision for what will be accomplished. That's why Tacoma and Olympia approved their programs with a majority of voters. The voters believed in this opportunity. Next, it's an important time to start planning community engagement. Your cultural access program won't have a chance if it doesn't have the support of your community. So engage them in the imagining process. You could do this through a variety of ways like surveying, focus groups, and other opportunities for both formal and informal conversations and information gathering. And last, here at Inspire Washington, we're still trying to figure out how to work with you, how to serve you, how to help and mentor you. So right now we've established a monthly cultural access roundtable. Come and join us. The next one will be on July 6th. We can all learn from each other and support each other as we all chart pathways forward for our communities. Once a month, we'll gather by Zoom to compare stories and challenges that will hopefully spur you forward. Also, this is all relatively new with House Bill 1575 passing just at the end of April. So we're also talking to a variety of different partners and funders. We're starting to imagine how we can develop a toolkit for communities. So we're really thinking about how we can bring tangible resources to these monthly meetings to really help you. So more on that. This is an evolving process, and we hope to be able to do more and more to support the growth of cultural access programs in every Washington region.
All right, so I'm going to start talking about some other funding resources that came out of the legislative session. However, if you have any questions about cultural access, once again, just put it in the chat. And we'll get to that. So next, we're going to talk about that $2 million that was allocated to the broad cultural sector. So first, I want to preface this with saying it was just allocated on April 22nd. So there is not a whole lot to know yet, but we're in conversation with the Department of Commerce regularly. So here's what they have shared with us. It's going to be a similar process to Working Washington 5. So for those of you who experience this process, you can expect that as well. It will be managed by the Department of Commerce in partnership with ArtSWA. Also, what we know about it is that it is once again federal funding. So what do we know about federal funding is you have to have a UEI number, a unique entity identifier. And let me tell you something. We at Inspire Washington learned the hard way that our UEI expires. So I don't know if this is true for you, but it was certainly true for us that it expired at the beginning of the year. So make sure you go to sam.gov and check and see and ensure that your UEI does not expire before the end of the calendar year so that you have that ready to go when it's time to apply for this funding. Also, if you are a nonprofit organization, you're also going to need your 990. And just to reiterate that this funding, just like Working Washington 5, it will be applicable to for-profit as well as nonprofit arts, heritage, and science organizations, including individual artists and for-profit venues that do concerts and things like that. So it's the broad breadth of the creative economy, very similar to Working Washington 5. Additionally, we do acknowledge that $2 million is not what Working Washington 5 was last year at $45 million. So we anticipate these funds to be around $5,000 per organization. $5,000. Did I say 5 million? I meant 5,000. $5,000 is still a really significant chunk of change for folks. So I'm going to send you a survey after this, and I would really love to hear how you all would spend $5,000. What would make the greatest impact on your organization? And we are going to be passing along these ideas to the Department of Commerce. This was actually a question that Shannon Halberstadt, the Creative Economy Sector Lead of the Department of Commerce, asked us to ask all of you as they are starting to develop this granting opportunity. So please share your thoughts and ideas. Just some examples. When we were out in Pullman at the beginning of our tour, our friends out at the Regional Theater of the Palouse, they told us that they would spend $5,000 on volunteer events because so much of their business is run by volunteers. So they wanted to be able to bring all of those people back that they had lost during COVID and to spur greater involvement. Another one opportunity is another organization was going to use $5,000 to hire a grant writer to then write more grants so they can get more money. So that's a pretty great impact. Another arts education organization said that $5,000 would support 2 more schools. So gosh, think about that broad impact of adding 2 whole schools to their lineup. So those are the types of ideas that we're looking for, or maybe you have even better ones. The next funding opportunity I'm going to talk about is the local and community capital projects, which is managed by the Department of Commerce, and they distribute funds. Natalie, you can go to the first bullet point. Yep, they provide reimbursable style grants to local governments as well as nonprofit organizations. So think like your local pool, your local library, as well as any nonprofit organizations. And this is specifically to build or improve buildings. So like HVAC systems, ADA compliance, a fallen roof, old signs, things like that. So a little bit of background is distributed by the Department of Commerce from the capital budget. Washington State has 3 different budgets. The capital budget is funded by bonds that the state sells. So it's a very stable source of funding for them. And these projects are pretty hefty. They're generally 6 figures. The biggest one this year was $5 million. Just to give you some context, the local and community capital projects, there was 330 of them this year, which was $912 million. So almost $1 billion of funding is provided to this line of funding. And from that, there were 22 arts and culture projects, which accounted for $20 million. So we would really love to see more funding from there that goes into local community capital projects. I just saw a question about there is no match. This is unlike Building for the Arts. This is a strict granting opportunity. So to be considered for a capital project, a couple things. You must have a capital project. You must have something that you need to be done to your building. You also have to have site control of the space. Either you own the property in the building or you have a lease of minimum of 10 years. And then of course you must be able to front the funding so that you can submit for reimbursement. Because once again, this is a reimbursement style only. And lastly, you must be officially sponsored by a member of the legislature. So either your senator or one of your representatives must officially sponsor you through this process. There isn't a website that you can just go and apply for this. You have to have a relationship with one of your legislatures and they can have to sponsor you through that process. So this is where those off-session meetings really come into play. So if you have something going on with your building, maybe you want to, put in new dressing rooms or something like that, schedule that off-session meeting with your senator, invite them, show them the project that you want to do, show them the things that you want to change and make better, and then get them excited about it. Generally, in the like the big sessions in the budget years, each member of the legislature gets about $2 million that they can distribute through local and community capital projects. And then if you add that all up, that's $6 million per district. That's a lot of funding available. And of course, in the supplemental years, it's a little bit less. But there's funding to be had out there. We would love to help you, support you with this. If you want to find out more information, you can go to the Department of Commerce's website. Just type in local community projects, Washington Department of Commerce. You'll see a lot of information there. You can always reach out to me. We helped. There were, just to give you a little bit of context and why this is kind of on our radar, we were working with one of our representative champions, Liz Berry. She's the one that put in for the large operating budget request, but she knew that the funding wasn't going to be as high this year as it was last year, and of course she was right. But she said, well, we can get funding for cultural businesses through capital projects. So we helped her identify some businesses that we knew were already in the process of a capital project, and then she worked behind the scenes on her own to partner her colleagues, other representatives and senators, with those businesses. So she kind of did the work for us this time around in the background. And so out of those 11 organizations that we identified to her, 5 of them were funded through this. So, of course, we want to support the other 6 in the coming years in hopes that they can receive funding. But we were really thrilled that 5 received funding. We learned a lot about the process, and we're really excited to talk more broadly about it now in hopes that other businesses like you or any of you may get the funding you need to support your building. So again, always reach out. We can help you provide some context or help you schedule a meeting with one of your representatives or senators.
All right, so now let's talk about other ways the state may support the inspirational places in your community. There are several official funding programs for cultural facilities, and we want to start right now by talking about Building for the Arts. Since 1991, state government has provided $129 million for more than 262 capital projects through the Building for the Arts programs. Funds may be used for the acquisition, the new construction, and or the major renovation of facilities where art is shared, performed, or participated in. The program is just administered by the Department of Commerce. ArtsWatch chairs the grant selection committee. The maximum grant award is $2 million. There is no minimum size of grant, as they'd like to say, no project too small. They may cover up to 33% of total project costs. There is a match requirement, but it's been reduced. Several years ago, because of the passionate advocacy from community members across the state of Washington increased the cap from 12 million to 18 million. And they also reduced the match requirement. Why did they do all this? Well, they certainly see the benefit of having arts facilities in different communities. This program has been very popular with the legislature. When arts facilities are refurbished or built from scratch, the whole community benefits in a lot of different ways. So they want to encourage these buildings, and they especially want to see more applications from Eastern Washington. And so those are some of the reasons why they increase the cap to make it a little bit less competitive, to give more state money, and also to reduce the match, because they know that sometimes those matching requirements are really when they're really catered towards more urban areas. So they wanted to make the money more accessible. What's the most important thing you need to know? Just get this program on your radar. We are about a year away from the next application deadline, spring of 2024. So this is not the kind of grant application that you start up like a month beforehand. It really is. It's a really challenging application, and you want to get started early. So what I would suggest is go check out the website. You can do this easy, quick Google search, Department of Commerce, Washington, Building for the Arts. You'll find the webpage for the program. You can learn a lot there. On the right side of the page, there'll be information about the staff member at the Department of Commerce that you can reach out to. I encourage you to set some time up, give them a call, talk about your ideas. It is their job to help you develop a strong proposal, and you have 1 year to do that. All right, let's move on to the next program, which is Heritage Capital. Similar to Building for the Arts. Oh, if you could, yeah, thank you. Similar to Building for the Arts, this is for cultural facilities, but this program is for facilities where Washington legacies and histories are told. So that includes historical museums, historical societies, historical collections or archives, or historical sites themselves. This program, you've heard a lot about the Department of Commerce. However, this program is different. It is not administered by the Department of Commerce. It is just the program is administered by the Washington State Historical Society located in Tacoma, Washington. The maximum grant program investment in this fund is $10 million per biennium. The maximum grant award is $1 million. It has a similar timeline as Building for the Arts. So we're about a year away from the application. I encourage you to learn more by visiting the website for Washington State Historical Society and take some time talking about your project to get more information so that you'll be ready next spring to put a strong proposal in. There's one new capital program for cultural facilities, and that is the Historic Theater Grant Program. Across Washington State, there are 85 theaters that are over 50 years old. These are iconic places like Mount Baker Theater in Bellingham, the Capitol Theater in Yakima, the Paramount Theater in Seattle, or the 7th Street Theater in Hoquiam. But also what we know about these facilities is they're really old, and some of them aren't very accommodating to all members of our community. If you add up the deferred maintenance for all of these historical buildings, it totals over $42 million. And I think that number has been floating around for about a year. I think that number has gone up with the increased cost of materials. So it's really important for Washington State to address the deferred maintenance of these facilities to ensure that they continue to serve more members of their community for decades to come. I'm really happy about this program, but I'm not so thrilled that the state only invested $515,000 when there's a $42 million bill for deferred maintenance. So you can probably count on Inspire Washington to be looking at opportunities in the future to advocate for more funds. But if you run a historical theater, or you have a friend in your network that works at a historical theater, certainly bring their attention to this grant program. This program is administered by the Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation, DAP, that's the state agency. But the grant is actually, they work with Washington Trust and Preservation to distribute the funds and to run the application process. So you can learn more at Washington Trust and Preservation's website. And if you have any questions about that, throw them in the chat and we'll answer them. I'll answer them while Jesse talks about Arts for All.
I know we have an awful lot of arts education supporters in our Zoom room today, so I just wanted to draw some attention to our Arts for All Coalition. This is a combined partnership between Inspire Washington, Arts Edwa, and OSPI, and we are working as a coalition for the full inclusion of arts learning across Washington state. We know that arts education in different communities are not equal. Not all students in Yakima receive the same level of arts education as the students in Seattle. We know that. But what we don't have is data to support that, those anecdotal stories that we have. So we are working together. We just received an NEA grant to continue this work. We are creating a data dashboard of information about very specific, based on school districts, based on cities, everything, what students are receiving all across the state. So once we have this data, then we'll be able to go to the legislature and say, hey, look, here's the problem. We need the funding and the resources to fix this. So we actually just gathered last week as a full coalition in person, statewide coalition. And we got a preview of the data dashboard. And let me tell you, Washington State, we are at 58% of arts access across the state. So there's a lot to do to build that number up. So we are going to be sharing this data dashboard with everyone. It will be public probably towards the end of the summer. And then we'll have more resources and opportunities for you to get involved. If this is something you're passionate about, and if you want to engage in this arts education work, we encourage you to go to our Inspiration League website at inspirationleague.org and click on the Arts for All Champions link and join this coalition. We'd love to have you involved. Last slide.
All right, everyone, you made it. Thank you so much for staying with us through the entire presentation. I just want to wrap up by talking about federal opportunities. It's sometimes hard to imagine why do the decisions that are made in Washington, D.C. matter to the cultural sector in Washington State. And I'm going to tell you, it matters quite a bit. If you don't understand the authorization process for the National Endowment for the Arts, I'm excited to share with you that when Congress appropriates money to the National Endowment for the Arts and National Endowment for the Humanities, the law that authorizes that program requires that 60% of that money is distributed to cultural arts, creative businesses nationwide through the NEA offices in DC, but 40% of that money is divided up between the 50 states based off of population, and it is given to this, it's subgranted to the state. Washington must, like every other state, Texas and California, must match it dollar by dollar, a minimum of dollar by dollar, and that becomes the basis of our ArtsWA budget, which is then distributes funding across all 39 of Washington counties. So the simplest way to kind of talk about why it matters is more money upstream means more money downstream, more money for all of your communities and your organizations. So we are very involved in appropriation work in Washington, D.C. So here's your update about things that we're working on. We've been to D.C. I've been to D.C. twice already this year and working with our very relatively generally supportive congressional delegation. Last year, we saw a record high appropriation to the NEA and the NEH of $207 million. The president is recommending that Congress appropriate $211 million for fiscal year 24. But you may be watching the news. There's been a big shakeup in Congress, and now we have two chambers, the House and the Senate, under different caucuses, and they don't often agree. So our baseline goal is to maintain the appropriation levels at over $200 million. And that's what I've been advocating for on your behalf. We'll probably send out an action alert at the end of the summer. Washington state advocacy matters on this issue because our Senator Murray is one of the most powerful members of the Senate and is the chair of the Appropriations Committee. They're the ones making the budget decisions. There are a number of other appropriations that we're working on that I think that you would be really in support of, such as, since it seems so hard to increase the budgets of the NEA and the NEH, I put in appropriation requests in support with other coordination of other arts advocates across the nation for appropriations in the Department of Defense that would provide new grant programs where organizations that can apply for funds to create programs that serve enlisted members, their families, their children. So imagine how great that would be on the peninsula of Washington, around Fairfax, Fairchild Air Force Base in Spokane, or along the I-5 corridor. It just creates another source of funding and another tactic of getting funds, because it's so hard to get more money added to the NEA and the NEH budget, but it seems as if the Department of Defense just gets a blank check. There are a number of bills that we're working on too, such as Rebuild Rural America Act, which would provide an investment in developing infrastructure in rural areas. And there's carve outs for cultural places and spaces in that. So we're getting excited about that. And the Performing Artists Tax Parity Act, which will provide artists the same deduction level as other micro businesses get. I know it's so hard being a gig worker, an artist. I've done that work. I've lived that life. And I really want to see you get the same treated as fairly as other businesses. There's a lot of work here. Make sure you're registered in the Inspiration League. If you have very specific questions about anything in the federal space, please reach out to me, Manny@inspirewashington.org. I'd be happy to set up time for a coffee or a Zoom and talk further about it.
Well, thank you all so much for joining us. That is the end of our presentation. We have a little bit of time that we can take questions, but also you're always welcome to email us. My email is Jessie, Jessi, at inspirewashington.org. And of course, Manny just shared his email address. He is Manny@inspirewashington.org, or Madeline@advocacy@inspirewashington.org. But if you have any questions, we have a few minutes. You can just unmute yourself and join us.